and welcome. This is an Ealing Libraries author event in which I, Dr. Jonathan Oates, Archivist for London Borough of Ealing, will have the great pleasure of discussing an important historical topic with Brett Bebber, who I shall now introduce. I'll be asking him a number of different questions and he'll be giving very informative answers, and hopefully you will find this interesting and entertaining. If I can introduce our speaker first. Brett Bebber is Associate Professor and Designated University Professor at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, United States. He specializes in modern British history and the history of the British Empire. In particular, he is interested in the ways in which the decline of the empire and the surge of migration to post-war Britain reshaped national identity and social relationships within the metropole. He has written on the intersections of race, gender, and violence in post-war Britain and studied the cultural implications of social control, working class violence, and political racism in modern British culture. His newest research threads include a study of migrant integration and Black civil rights activism in Britain in the 1960s and 1970s, and an examination of how civil liberties and anti-racist organizations made transatlantic connections with American and Canadian civil rights groups. He regularly teaches courses on modern British history, the history of the British Empire, European imperialism, transatlantic history, and sport and leisure. So, an impressive record. Now, if
Thank
we can
you for the kind introduction. That's very nice of you.
Yes. And now, if we can begin with the first question, and I think it's best to start at the beginning with a really obvious question, because we are talking today about busing as it occurred in the borough of Ealing in the 1960s and the 1970s. So the first question I think to ask, which many people may not know the answer to or may not even heard of, is what was busing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, basically from the early 1960s through 1981, citing a need to assimilate migrant students into British culture, the borough of Ealing bussed South Asian students away from their neighborhood schools, their home schools, and enrolled them in schools that were further away from their homes that had fewer migrant children enrolled generally. Now, the increasing number of migrants in the area and their supposed detrimental effect on education frightened local parents, especially those who considered themselves native Britons. These parents pressured Ealing Council to implement busing to maintain a majority of white native children in each school in the borough. Of course, native can be in quotes here because that's a term that they designated for themselves, not one that really has any purchase historically. Now, the plan was to have no more than 33% of the student body in any given school be migrant children. Okay, and we'll talk about how they define migrant and immigrant children later. Ealing began the practice as part of a broader scheme of integrating migrant children into their local system. This included other elements like transport to language training centers and to immigrant reception centers for new students. So to put it kind of bluntly, Jonathan, from day to day, thousands of young South Asian and Afro-Caribbean students boarded buses that took them away from their home neighborhoods and towards others that had a lower concentration of non-white children, or to special centers which offered language instruction. The general idea was to disperse migrant children of color to multiple schools, either within the borough or sometimes outside of it, to maintain a ratio of predominantly white children in the Ealing district schools. Of course, each morning children would board a bus and ride several miles, sometimes over 10 or 12 miles, to other schools in West and North London to receive special language training or simply to reduce the number of migrant children in their home school. The busing system and its advocates was initially supported by the Department of Education and Science, and it kind of relied on these ill-defined ideas of what assimilation and integration should look like. These ideas, of course, tended to privilege British cultural authority, the desires of native parents, and ignored the cultural contributions of Commonwealth migrants. Now, the LEA, the borough's local education authority, had begun the practice a few years before desegregation busing in the United States, but they later adopted justifications from the American experience to legitimize their actions. That's something I'd like to talk about today if we have time. The practice kind of lent itself to American comparisons. Across the Atlantic, busing was seen as a progressive civil rights practice that desegregated schools, that brought children, for African American and white children together. But in Ealing, it was sort of used for a different purpose.
Thank you. That seems a very comprehensive and thorough start to all this. But perhaps the next question, people might be wondering why yourself as an American academic have begun to investigate busing in Ealing in Britain.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I didn't start out thinking I would pursue this project. It was sort of something I stumbled across in the archives. I was looking at records as part of a larger project on race relations authorities in Britain, on race relations organizations in Britain, and particularly on the schemes to integrate migrants into British culture in the 60s and 70s. I'm also keen to kind of study the rejection of these organizations and these authorities and schemes by various ethnic communities. And so what was interesting to me about busing in Ealing is that I could kind of use it as a way to understand these general dynamics and the importance these race relations authorities placed on the borough as a sort of experimental site for various integrationist strategies and migrant dispersal measures. Busing, believe it or not, was a key experiment that kind of ultimately failed, but demonstrated the various views of race integration and belonging present in Britain during this period. So I began to be keenly interested in how busing embodied this wide range of political views and educational methods to all of these multiple parties and organizations involved in the practice, from the national to the local level. As I mentioned before, Ealing kind of began busing with these ill-defined assimilationist objectives, but they were supported by the parents of white children who disapproved of the growing number of South Asians in the area, ultimately supported by the Department of Education and Science, who preferred these sort of predetermined ratios of Native and Native and migrant children in local schools. And then there were also local organizations and South Asian parents who viewed busing as a discriminatory kind of transgression of British law, rather than as a progressive system, no matter its kind of transatlantic resonances or the gloss it was borrowing from America. So those are just a few of the parties involved, but then there's also educational officers, race relations watchdogs, various ethnic organizations that imbued busing with their own political values and kind of capitalized on the opportunity busing presented to advance their visions of what post-colonial England should look like. So I guess to kind of put it in sum, busing in Ealing kind of became emblematic of all these big, ill-defined notions of assimilation and integration. They became a sort of workshop where Ealing became a workshop where busing was one experiment to try out some of these integrationist schemes.
Now, we've already talked a little bit about how did busing begin, with the concerns of white parents and the reaction of the local education authority. But perhaps you could talk a little bit in more detail about how actually busing did begin in Ealing and when, such like.
Yeah, so there was the Ealing Council sort of formally bused students to largely to satisfy Department of Education and Science requirements that came into effect in 1965, that local schools should not allow, quote unquote, immigrant populations to become the majority. The borough had experimented with it before that point, up to 2 years earlier, and it became sort of widespread after the borough expanded in 1965, something you know about, Jonathan, right, where it started to include both Acton and Southall in addition to Ealing. Now, this kind of national policy that gave it justification in large part derived from Sir Edward Boyle, conservative minister for state for education, who visited Southall in 1963 to assess the kind of changing demographics in the neighborhood. 400 local parents showed up to attend the meeting with Boyle, and they called for Boyle to provide separate educational facilities for Indigenous and immigrant pupils. Those are the terms they used, Indigenous and immigrant pupils. Now they're talking about entirely different schools for each group of people, segregated schools. Instead, Boyle suggested that the number of immigrant students be limited to 1/3, that 33%, to the total of students in each school. One education official in Southall called the meeting the beginning of the, quote, crisis, and he said this, quote, "The English parents were very concerned and afraid that their children's education would suffer as a result of so many immigrants," end quote. Even after Boyle, a new Labor administration kind of codified the idea 18 months later in another Department of Education and Science circular, noting that, quote, "serious strains arise," end quote, "when the ratios at any school exceed this sort of imagined limit of 1/3. They suggested some form of dispersal or rearrangement of school districting as remedies, but in the meantime, busing continued because it was a practice that was in effect already in Ealing. There were also, as you know, right, these massive sort of pressures of population in Ealing itself. I've got a few numbers here that I think will help our audience understand how quickly the number of children in Ealing grew, okay? The number of students bused reveals these pressures. Between 1966 and 1972, the number of students labeled as immigrants by Ealing Borough rose from approximately 4,300 to 11,000 plus in the course of 6 years, from about 10% to 24% of total students. That's again from 1966 to 1972. Many individual schools, of course, had between 30 and 40% quote unquote immigrant pupils, and Southall secondary schools averaged 52.8%. The change was more pronounced at the sort of nursery level for nursery children, where migrants composed 43% of all nursery children by 1973. This, of course, was emblematic of the rising number of South Asians and Afro-Caribbeans that were moving to the area. Now, if we compare that to the national numbers, we'll see how Ealing sort of became such a focus for these types of schemes. In England and Wales combined, the total percentage of pupils deemed immigrant increased from only 2.1% to 3.3% over the same 6-year period I described earlier, from 1966 to 1972, reaching just over about 260,000 total students. So indeed, the borough faced far greater numbers of migrant students than nearly all other districts in Britain, and its LEA was more keen to try to address what they perceived to be a problem with that influx. Okay, so I want to just, if I could, I know I'm kind of all over the place, I'm giving you some numbers, but I want to kind of provide a sense of how they defined the term immigrant so that we can get a better sense of how many of these children, right, were there. Ealing defined quote unquote immigrant children as either those born outside of Britain, or importantly, children born in the British Isles whose parents had lived there for less than 10 years, okay? That meant that children who were born in Britain under the age of 10, right, were still considered to be immigrants, okay? The borough did separate in its calculations between South Asians, Afro-Caribbeans, and others, kind of 3 subcategories of the term immigrant. And South Asian children made up a vast majority of the total category. I think I can also sort of give you a sense of the sort of anxieties that these types of numbers provoked in 3 quotes. Are you ready? Okay, 3 quotes. Boyle said this at the Southall meeting. He said, "It is both politically and legally more or less impossible to compel Native parents to send their children to a school in an immigrant area," end quote. He added, quote, "One must recognize the perfectly legitimate anxiety of many of the parents," end quote, "who worried that teachers would have their attention stolen by those in educational need." This became a common argument for white parents, that too much attention would be given to children who needed language training or special attention in training in British culture, whatever that meant. Okay, so that's 1 quote. Second, the Commonwealth Immigrants Advisory Council, appointed by the state to assess the impact of immigration on local authorities, said this, quote, "A national system of education must aim at producing citizens who can take their place in society properly equipped. A national system cannot be expected to perpetuate the values of immigrant groups, end quote. So again, we see even national bodies starting to undermine the contributions, the cultural contributions of South Asians in favor of British culture. And then last, one by Nicholas Deacon, a race relations authority who wrote a book called Color and Citizenship in Britain. He said, quote, "The school's role in the process of integration was seen as a social one at this time. It would train immigrants to be British and provide a location where they could mix with English children," end quote. Okay, so all of that anxiety, right, and these sort of ill-defined ideas of British culture, natives, and immigrants led to about 2,000 to 2,500 primary school pupils being bused in Ealing by 1966, okay? It cost the borough in 1966 9,000 plus pounds. And by 1971, the numbers of bus students had become so large that it cost an estimated 102,000 pounds, from 9,000 to 102,000. The statistics are less clear for secondary students who could choose to be bused to another district but weren't required to. But by 1973, according to one researcher, 3,400 of the 4,000 students bused in England and Wales were in the Ealing system. Those numbers are massive compared to other districts. The next largest disperser was Bradford's LEA, who bused 175 students regularly. Okay, Ealing, not only spent massively, but it created a very entrenched system by the early 1970s that kind of became the benchmark nationally for how to disperse migrant children using busing.
Right. Well, that's a very comprehensive answer. Lots of things for people to think about. I suppose that the next question, and of course, lots of these questions do merge into one another, is how do people respond to busing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I sort of stumbled upon busing as a project because of the oral histories that have been collected that are at the Gunnersbury Park Museum under the title of the South Asian Project. This is where local historians and museums in the Ealing area carried out a series of interviews between 2005 and 2006. And in addition to interviewing a wide range of local South Asians, they got them to discuss their memories of busing, often at the request of the interviewer. And their articulations sort of give us a sense of how people that were bused responded to the process. In the main, they emphasize that isolation, ostracism, and even violence could be pretty common. They also reveal that many South Asian children viewed busing as an accepted part of life in England. On the one hand, we had a lot of the interviews and responses from interviewees suggesting that they kind of remembered the excitement of school going. They recalled close associations with family members and even borough appointed escorts on the buses, all of whom were kind of involved in their day-to-day journeys. But alternatively, kind of given hindsight, many of the former children evoked concerns about racial violence, stigmatization by their peers. South Asian parents communicated broader criticisms of immigrant experiences in democratic Britain, and many of them remembered their attempts to challenge the practice. I have a couple of photos here that I think might help us at this point, Jonathan. Before I talk a little bit more about those responses, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you just to put those up. The first is a picture of students at an immigrant reception center. This was taken by one of the bus drivers, Valerie Gross, whose records are at the Gunnersbury Park Museum as well. The second sort of shows us students getting onto a bus. This one is uncredited, but shows us sort of that day-to-day experience that you had asked about earlier. And then the last one came from you, thankfully. I was so thankful to get this from you, that shows sort of some of the demonstrations against busing that I'm going to talk about here for a second. One of the things I noticed about in assessing all of those responses to busing in the South Asian Project was that primarily there was a strong sense of confusion. Many South Asian parents and children in Ealing accepted busing as a kind of common local practice, though they often lacked information about it. Many parents face the challenges of finding work, securing housing, learning the local education bureaucracy, often while not speaking English. This proved very difficult for many families and confusion abounded. I have a quote here from a man named Gurpal Singh Verdi, who was bused upon his arrival from New Delhi to Southall in 1966. He was aged 8. He remembered that his parents assented to busing because the family felt alien and compelled to follow protocol. He said, quote, Southall was a very white area then. There was only a few Asians there. I think at the time that dad was working, then mom started working as well. And because we were in a new environment and the rules were there, quote, we were bused. Another good quote I think is worth pulling in here. Sylvie Michael, she arrived from Singapore in 1970, recalled that her parents, quote, took it for granted. It was one of those things we had to do. She added that her parents thought she and her brother were bused because they registered for a school place late, which wasn't the case, right? So that's sort of one theme, is that there was confusion and a lack of information about the practice for our South Asian families. A second theme is that others simply hated it. One Pujami woman said, quote, I will truly say that it was horrible. All the children were of Asian origin. We felt like sheep being herded along, end quote. Another man who came with his children from Pakistan in 1965 remembered, quote, I found our Asian kids and Asian parents were not treated in the same way as white parents and their children. We were just unwanted, end quote. I mentioned before that some were even subjected to violence. In a letter to the Indian Workers Association, a group of children that had trekked regularly to Watford Secondary School from Southall to Ealing complained, quote, every morning and evening we have to change buses because we are of Indian or Asian origin, or putting it simply, colored. This gang of white boys from Vincent School beat every colored boy, then get hold of and spit on the girls. Because of this, some boys and girls don't attend the school or are unable to attend regularly, end quote. I think that gives you a sense, right, that this could be quite disruptive, violent, and incredibly disconcerting for many of the South Asian families. So confusion, others hated the practice. And then third, I would say that busing really created like some practical difficulties that parents and children found isolating and frustrating. There were mechanical problems with coaches and traffic. Students were often tardy and remembered being chastened for being tardy, even though they, of course, couldn't control the traffic or the buses. In some cases, there was some evidence that children were forced to wear badges that helped escorts identify which bus to put them on and where to send them. One student remembered that they had to wear a badge that was green with 3 black stars for students that were sent to St. John's School. A woman, Simrit Mann, said this, and I'll kind of finish my answer to this question with this quote. She said, being bussed out meant you never were at school before the start of the day. Your parents would never, ever be anywhere near your school. You would always come in late and be sort of sneaking in at the back. You would have brown faces at the back. I resented that kind of undue attention even more. You were never chosen for key roles in the school play or anything because obviously you were not going to stay behind to come to that in the evening. So I think that gives you a sense of the responses, at least among South Asian families, right? Confusion, a strong dislike for the practice, and then of course all of those practical difficulties that emerge when you start sending students miles or kilometers rather away from their home school.
Of course, the practice of busing, it lasted over just over 15 years. So it operated for what seems to be a very long time.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit, well, or a lot, about how busing came to an end.
Yeah, that's a great question too. And it's sort of a bit of a long story. I'll try to keep it brief. By the early 1970s, right, after having been bused for a decade, criticisms like those from the bus children I just read and their parents started to begin to attract national attention. It didn't hurt that in America, the issue had developed into a national argument as well. And so the press in Britain started to pay more attention to the practice in the UK as well. It also became, and at times was a flashpoint for broader controversies about the objectives of integration. This is sort of my area of research. Things like the implementation of the 1968 Race Relations Act, which outlawed formally discrimination in housing, employment, and of course, education. The Race Relations Board was sort of charged with enforcing the act and promoting good relations in areas like Ealing. And so they sort of started to work with local South Asian community associations, the Home Office, even the Ealing Council to investigate busing's rationale and to figure out if it was indeed discriminatory. Growing criticism from many of the groups I'd like to talk about here for a second resulted in the board deeming Ealing's busing system legally discriminatory by 1975, but the practice doesn't end until 1981 because there are years of negotiation about how to end the practice and how Ealing would place the students that had already been started at a previous school. Okay. One of the reasons the board felt so justified in taking the case was because of the immense amount of criticism from a variety of organizations in Ealing. I'll just give you a couple of examples. You and I had talked earlier about the Indian Workers Association and its leader Ajit Singh Rai. Rai took control of the IWA after an internal dispute, and he sort of reversed the organization's position, attacking busing as emblematic of broader racisms when earlier the organization had supported it. He connected it to broader ideas like Britain's immigration control legislation and broader educational provision across the country. He appeared on news programs, television news programs several times, met directly with Ealing education officers, and sort of constantly became a very loud voice in the opposition of the families he represented. He said this: "What makes them suffer at school is the cultural conflict. Arrangements are needed to provide the immigrant children with a thorough knowledge and background of the culture of the countries they have come from. But the lack of educational exploration of anything beyond the host community resulted in, quote, the development of a sort of inferiority complex. When students are confronted with a situation to explain about their own religion or culture, they find themselves quite ignorant." I was concerned that students weren't being taught about their own home cultures, that there was such an emphasis on British life. So Rai was sort of joined by other race relations bodies. There was a group called the Ealing Community Relations Council that saw blatant discrimination simply because white children were not bused also, right? Carl Munn of the ECRC argued, quote, "Children of 5 years old are still being taken long distances to strange surroundings for the most formative years of their education," end quote. He added that the ECRC will not rest until this situation no longer exists. Even the national body, the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, a legal association that promoted migrants' civil and legal rights, said frankly, quote, "Dispersal is all one-way traffic." They noted that, quote, "Immigrant parents haven't got the same rights as white parents in the district." Even the Communist Party got involved. John Boyd, writing for the Communist Party in West Middlesex, noted that busing provided a, quote, "smokescreen," end quote, for widespread educational neglect. He actually provided this really helpful argument that he suggested that, hey, all the money that was being spent on busing could have been used to build new schools in Ealing by now. He did some building calculations. He collected building calculations from the borough, and he confirmed that annual busing costs exceeded £200,000 by 1975, while estimates for new construction of individual schools were around about £200,000. So in the end, the Race Relations Board did end up opening proceedings, collected all this information, sought help from university experts, collected testimonies for legal action, and in November 75, they announced that the Ealing body was guilty of racial discrimination. Now, for those 6 years between 1975 and 1981, there was a series of negotiations between the Race Relations Board, the Department of Education and Science, and the Borough of Ealing, where the Borough of Ealing was saying, great, we'll end busing as soon as you build us more schools. And in 1978, they came to an agreement to build 2 new primary schools in Southall. And in 1978 as well, the Department of Education and Science formally removed that circular requiring the 33% quota.
Obviously, you've done an incredibly large amount of research, as your conversation already reveals. Could you tell us, perhaps in a few or in many sentences, perhaps, what do you think the most important findings of your research have been?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I am kind of giving you a deep dive because I want our audience in Ealing to understand sort of the outlines and the details, and not just the outlines of what had happened. I think sort of from an overall perspective, learning about busing in Ealing, knowing about these broader integration schemes and race relations bodies elsewhere, and then also sort of considering what happened with busing in other places, I guess I could kind of say a couple things. The first finding I think is important to emphasize perhaps is that busing was absolutely discriminatory, right? It was a form of detrimental educational discrimination that encouraged ostracism and racial abuse against South Asian children. I think the evidence is clear in that regard. The voices of South Asian students and their parents really brought this idea home. They worked to undermine these sort of ill-conceived and unscientific notions of educational integration, undermined the international credibility that comparisons to America lent the Ealing Borough. They did so to the effect that the National Race Relations Authorities and the DES eventually opposed busing by the 1970s, worrying that they had that the practice aimed to separate and disperse recently constructed migrant communities. So I think it's fair to say, right, that it was actually discriminatory. It was actually based on some sort of ill-defined racist ideas and was worked out in a way that allowed South Asian families to voice their opposition. I think we could scratch a little bit of many of those unspoken assumptions about race that certainly featured in considerations of busing and Ealing if we wanted to know more about what was going on there. But it was very clear that there was an idea that the assumed cultural ascendancy of white Englishness should be privileged, right? And that migrant culture mattered less than children becoming acculturated or assimilated into white Englishness. Ealing officials, for example, right, never seriously considered busing white children alongside South Asian pupils, in part because they viewed the migrants' presence as disruptive. So that'd be my first finding. I think the second thing I think that's worth emphasizing are these American justifications that were eventually kind of exposed as twisted and misapplied. The deliberations throughout the 1970s that sort of showed that Ealing's transatlantic copy or reproduction of busing as a sort of justifiable liberal practice that promoted integration didn't really copy precisely across the pond. In the US, both African American and white students were bused from segregated neighborhoods to newly desegregated school districts as a means of promoting the integration of schools and challenging centuries-old racial discriminations in education in America. But in Ealing, busing occurred to keep children of color from overtaking an imagined line, a ratio of predominantly white students in British schools. Okay, so the exact, it's not exactly the opposite, but it's being twisted and misapplied in this regard. This sort of American method for promoting civil rights as a means of integrating integration concretized anti-migrant attitudes in England rather than promoting pluralism. So in these sort of different historical, demographic, and linguistic environments in England and the United States, the practice didn't really copy correctly. It was mostly used as justification for what Ealing, what the Ealing Council wanted to accomplish. I think the last finding I might emphasize is this kind of interesting designation of Ealing as this sort of workshop or laboratory for national issues about integration and migrant dispersal. The rapid changes, demographic and otherwise, that were wrought to the composition of Ealing neighborhoods, the adverse reaction by native British citizens in Ealing, led many demographers, housing and education experts, race relations authorities, even university experts from across Europe to view the borough as sort of a laboratory for integration. The Home Office sent several delegations to the borough in the 1960s to gauge its ability to pioneer integration in other cities. Busing, of course, was one of these key practices that they were contemplating. Each of these delegations assessed not only education, but housing, community relations, urban development, other matters relevant to broader political conversations about the integration of migrants. So one of these Home Office delegations, right, reported in this sort of remarkably self-congratulatory tone that, quote, what had been done locally in Southall might well serve as the basis for a handbook for others on how best to promote a climate of opinion and understanding, end quote. Even other government agencies, right, saw Ealing as this sort of workshop for various integrationist ideologies. Many Londoners identified this area of West London as cultural pluralism in progress. One London writer romanticized it this way. He said, woven with the metal of migrant myths, dreams, and realities, cut from the flowing fabric of Asian culture by pioneers using the tools and physical surrounds of the West, Southall has provided a pattern of cross-cultural living in a post-war Britain, end quote. So these quotes kind of attest to this idea, right, that as well as these visits by the Home Office, that Ealing was something of an experiment for a larger national platform of integration.
Well, I think that have given our audience a huge amount of material culled from your research, and research indeed is impressive, especially as you're predominantly working in America, but you have clearly had to use material in the UK. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your research methods and which materials did you find of most use in your research work?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, obviously, I travel to Britain quite regularly to do my research. I found the early materials on busing in the Home Office and the Race Relations Board files that are at the National Archives in Kew. I then traveled to Gunnersbury Park Museum to listen to those, spent about 2 weeks listening to the testimonies of South Asian families from the South Asian Project. Those materials sort of formed the larger basis for the book, but then I read other things that others had written about Ealing and Southall and Acton to get a better sense of what things were like in the 60s and 70s there. But for my particular materials, the Department of Education and Science, Home Office, Race Relations Board records were really informative. They gave me a sense of how both the national and the local sort of handled this problem. We do have a colleague, Olivier Esteves, who has done more research on the local level, not only at Ealing, but at Bradford and at other local education districts to kind of see what things looked like from the ground up. That's also very important research that I think complements my own quite well. But generally speaking, I was in the archives, in the libraries, dusting through old documents like historians do, trying to figure out what had happened with this project.
So would you say that a National Archives at Kew was one of your major places of research?
Would I say that? Is that what you asked, Jonathan?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is this, it is of course a massive repository, but in addition, one of the ways the Race Relations Board worked was that it collected reports and testimonies from places like Ealing and Bradford and sort of put them all into, say, one box or one set of files, which made it quite easy for me to explore them, at least at the beginning, rather than having to visit all of the different localities like other researchers have done. It was a way to see the national importance of these local issues. And yes, the National Archives were quite informative for what I was studying.
So I think finally, perhaps, what's your next plan for research and writing?
Well, that's kind of you to ask that. I mean, I'm still working on projects on integration schemes in Britain, and in particular on these race relations organizations and their interactions with migrant communities. That's sort of my ongoing interest. I've published a little bit about that so far, but I'm hoping to kind of complete a book on that soon that will discuss all of these attempts at integration that came right alongside the sort of immigration laws in the 1960s and 1970s, immigration legislation that was promoted by both parties, right, conservative and labor along the way, and really trying to understand the dynamics between these race relations organizations on a national level, their local representatives, and of course, the many ethnic organizations that either worked with them or challenged them on a regular basis for how they were carrying out supposed integration and assimilation ideas. So that really interests me. Of course, the connection for me as an American researcher is that a lot of these race relations experts and Home Office experts travel to the United States, to the East Coast where I live, and we're meeting with civil rights activists here to attempt to figure out how civil rights was progressing in the 1960s and 1970s here, and if there were any things they could borrow to take back home to Britain. That's the sort of international transatlantic element that I'm interested in as well.
I suppose that this is probably an obvious question. I'm afraid it's not on the list. I can't remember if you said that you're writing a book on busing, or is busing obviously an important part of the wider subjects that you might be bringing a book out in the near future?
No, I'm not writing a book on busing. I would like to. I think that's a little bit, it might be a little bit grand for a book, but Olivier Esteves, a French researcher, has written a book on busing, not just in Ealing, but in all of those other areas, and sort of understands it from the press and national perspective. The book is excellent. I highly recommend it. I've worked with Olivier on other projects. I'm more interested in how busing and other schemes might be a part of larger ideas of integration that were taking root amongst these quote unquote race relations professionals in the 1960s and 70s.
So perhaps in the near future, we can look forward to a book by yourself about race relations and integrationist projects in late 20th century Britain at some stage. Maybe.
At some stage. It's on its way. It takes a little time to write a book. And, you know, I travel to Britain quite often. COVID's put a bit of a kink in those plans. But yeah, I do hope to finish the research and finalize the book soon.
We would certainly want to buy at least one or more copies of your book when it's ready. So please do keep us posted, and when the book comes out, we'll hopefully be able to purchase a few copies of it. That would be
nice.
That would be absolutely splendid and very useful, because lots of our researchers are interested in post-war immigration, especially to Southall. It's one of the more popular topics that people want to investigate from all different aspects, from politics, religion, culture, shopping, economics, and so on. And it would be good for people to have such a great book as I'm sure you would produce as an aid to their studies, to their theses and other projects.
Yeah, that makes sense. I really appreciate you giving me a chance to talk to people locally about a bit of their history. I hope that I've represented it well.
Is there anything else you want to say, or are we...
No, I'm good, Jonathan. People are probably tired of hearing me talk by now. That was a lot that I wanted to share, but I really appreciate you asking good questions, and thank you so much again for the chance to talk about it.
Well, thank you for your time and for us gaining the experience and knowledge from all the hours and hours and hours of work that you put in both in Britain and America, and obviously for your time this afternoon, when I'm sure you got thousands of other things you need to be doing. So thank you for your time, listeners and viewers. I hope you found this talk interesting. We will be having more local history talks or topics on local themes. In the near future, there is one by myself about Asian and Indian cinema in Southall from 1950s to the 2000s, and I am also giving in the near future a talk about Black actors in Ealing Studios films from the 1930s to the 1950s. So all different aspects and different viewpoints on a fairly similar theme. Hopefully these will be interesting, informative, educational, and of use and interest. We're always interested in feedback on things that we're doing well, things that we could be doing better at, things that you that you're interested in but we're not quite covering, or any other ideas that you have of topics or subjects that you would be interested in us covering with talks from staff members and from authoritative speakers such as Bebber and many other people who we're very lucky to have with us for a short time. Thank you again, and
thank you.
farewell.
You too.